Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Christina Dankmeyer. I'm an advisor with Christina Dankmeyer. I'm an advisor with GIZ, also helping to coordinate a task force of partners working on linking adaptive social protection and climate financing jointly with partners, including FAO, including also the ILO, other UN organizations, climate funds, and multilateral development banks. And today we want to talk about integrating social protection in NDCs. We are going to explain a little bit more what social protection actually is before going into the nuts and bolts of how to actually address social protection in NDCs for more ambitious and inclusive climate action. And before the NDCP will come in with a few housekeeping rules, I'll hand over to my colleague Matthew and also Francisca for a quick introduction. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Christina, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. So I'm Matt Walsham. I work at FAO in the social protection team, and my focus is particularly on social protection and the links to climate change. As well as participating in the task force that Christina mentioned, I'm also co-chair of the Universal Social Protection 2030 Working Group on Social Protection and Climate Change, along with colleagues from ILO and Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Centre, and we've been working extensively on this area and feeding into the development of this note. So it's exciting to be able to share this work with you. I'll hand across to Francisca.
Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Francisca Fürst. I'm the component leader for the social protection portfolio in a GIZ project called Improving Social Protection and Health in Cambodia. And I will later present the case of Cambodia successfully integrating social protection into the NDC 3.0 process. Thank you.
All right, just checking with the NDCP, do you want to take on the housekeeping rules, or should we just maybe start with the next slide? We can also quickly walk everybody through those.
We can actually do that. So just good morning, everybody. My name is Tima. I'm the event officer from NDC Partnership. Just to inform you that this webinar, we have interpretation online. So if you click on the globe icon found on the bottom, you can unmute you can find the French interpretation and Spanish interpretation. And also, if you prefer to unmute the original audio during presentation in your preferred language to listen to the presentation. The Q&A and chat, so feel free to use the chat function through the session to share comments, resource, or engaging with other participants. We encourage you to introduce yourself and share what organization or country you're joining from. If you also have any specific question for the speakers, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, as they will be monitored. For your information, this session will be recorded, and I'm assuming it will be also shared. Thank you so much, and I think I can hand it to you, Christina.
Thank you so much for the introduction and all the useful information for participants. All right, let's dive right in. If you can just jump to the next slide. So today we want to introduce an additional policy area to you. We have, if you can just click one more time, should jump to the next slide. There we go. We have the NDCP as a partner in our joint task force as a key partner in this area of providing expertise and also matchmaking to different member countries. And the NDCP last year in June published or launched the NDC 3.0 Navigator, which is a very helpful tool to actually inform the updates of NDCs, so the third generation of nationally determined contributions this year, in terms of how to align to the Paris Agreement temperature goal, number one, to align to the Paris Agreement global goal on adaptation, and also delivering on a just and equitable transition. And this is actually the third area here you see on the right, where we are also located with this topic. If you can click one more time, it should show the key policy areas. There we go. So the key policy areas are, sorry, the slide just disappeared again. You can go back to it. The key policy areas are social protection, which we'll talk about today, reskilling and upskilling of workers as well, job creation, and those often go hand in hand. So you may want to provide training and income support to actually help people reintegrate into the labor market, find new jobs, also in the future green and more sustainable economy, and also help them diversify in terms of their livelihoods and broader economic diversification. And there are other areas such as sustainable enterprise development or community development schemes that fall under this area as well. Now, just to say, before we go into what social protection is and what it does help to deliver a just transition, but it also actually can help to align with the Paris Agreement goals, the temperature goal and the global goal on adaptation. We'll talk a bit about that today as well, how that works and what design features we need to take into account in order to accomplish that. So first of all, going to the next slide, what is social protection? Because we realize there are probably quite a few members from the climate community on the call who are not necessarily social protection experts, and that is totally fine. We'll first look at what the connections are between social protection and climate action. We will then look at how social protection can actually enable more ambitious and inclusive climate action. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Matthew, who will give you a sense of what the value added is across mitigation, adaptation, and also loss and damage of social protection, give you a few examples from existing NDCs where social protection has already been successfully integrated, and also provide you with a checklist, what the next steps might be in your respective countries or projects. And this checklist is based on a guidance note that we recently published in contribution to the NDC Partnership, placing people at the center of NDCs 3.0, the power of social protection to accelerate climate action. The link is in the presentation, but I'm sure we can also just post it in the chat for everybody to take a look at that. It's on the NDCP website. All right, so to start, what are the connections between social protection and climate action? First of all, to give you a sense of what social protection actually is and does, we have quite a few government-led policies and programs that we would count as social protection, because they actually protect people from, for example, income shortfalls, but also other vulnerability-related factors and poverty throughout their lives. And those policies and programs can take different shapes. So first of all, we have programs that provide income support directly and provide income earning opportunities. So you may be familiar with cash transfer programs that governments run, also in-kind transfers. There are also public works or public employment programs that make sure that people have sufficient income, especially, for example, during lean season. And those types of programs help people when their incomes are lost or insufficient, not just to meet their cost of living, but also make sure that their health is protected, or at least that they can pay for expenses, and also in case their ability to work is compromised. There are also other so-called contributory social protection schemes, whereas the first kind is more tax financed, government financed in most cases. The so-called contributory schemes or social insurance schemes include health insurance, old age or pension, accident insurance. And yeah, they basically pool risks, including also risks related to climate change. At national level, also sometimes at lower levels, so that people, when they are affected by a specific type of risk, can be protected. And then finally, depending on how wide we cast the net of this definition, we also count active labor market interventions as social protection. I already mentioned it's often job placement or subsidized skills development, so where you basically provide financial support in addition to, for example, training that can help people re-enter the labor market and also build skills that will be helpful in the future. Now that we have hopefully a very good understanding of what we're dealing with here, we want to look at how social protection can actually enable more ambitious and inclusive climate action. And we usually, in the climate world, look at these three areas: climate change mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And so we looked at these functions, essentially, how social protection can contribute to these respective goals. First of all, starting on the left side, social protection can actually enable more ambitious climate change mitigation policies. And how does that work? So first of all, we already talked about a just and equitable transition. It's important to help people as individuals in that transition to actually change their behavior, compensate also for potential negative impacts of, for example, climate policies. When we look at fossil fuel subsidy reform, or we look at carbon pricing, that can actually affect people and even increase poverty in certain contexts. And so in those cases, it's really important to provide financial and also job support to people. Also in the case of mine closures, there may be big layoffs. And so you need to figure out how to support people in those situations throughout the transition. And that is where social protection programs can come in. Equally, when it comes to managing natural resources more sustainably, there are certain types of social protection programs, for example, public works that I mentioned, that can actually help people secure their incomes throughout certain periods, and also at the same time making sure that they know how to manage natural resources more sustainably and actually, for example, manage land or water in those public works programs. And that also helps set them up better for the future and contribute to sequestration, so to also contributing to the reduction of emissions overall. Secondly, when we look at climate change adaptation, there the link may be rather obvious to most of you. We look at how people can actually secure their incomes, also make sure that they have access to healthcare and other services, while also being able to contribute to adaptations. On the one hand, people avoid negative coping strategies, for example, so also in a way maladaptation practices in some contexts, if their incomes are more secure and they don't have to, for example, cut down trees. But at the same time, we can also very actively contribute to climate change adaptation through certain types of social protection programs. For example, programs that help increase people's assets, increase their productivity and savings, which in turn can help them diversify and adapt their livelihoods to a changing climate going forward. We have a few examples of countries that have actually included this function in their NDCs later on. Mozambique is one of them. I'm sure Matt will mention that later to give you a better sense how that actually works in practice. And then finally, social protection programs can also play an important role when it comes to averting, minimizing, and addressing climate-related loss and damage. So what actually happens when certain types of risks and impacts cannot be avoided, and we see that more and more often in different country contexts. So how do we reach people affected and in need of support once those impacts are there? We can, for example, expand social assistance programs that countries already have. They may only cover small percentages of the population, but when you expand them, they can actually provide timely, cost-effective, and a rather people-centered approach to going the last mile and making sure that money reaches people at individual level when they're affected. And same also with covering injuries, sickness-related expenses that may occur once those impacts have affected people. That just as a broad overview how this works. We do have two quick examples on the next slide, what this actually means in practice. So on the one hand, it can have very positive personal impacts. We have an example from Bangladesh, where last year in July, there was a severe flood and people actually received money basically the morning after the floods began. Water was everywhere. People could only get to places by boat. But with the money they received, they were able to buy groceries, for example. And they received this support that was provided by international partners through a government program. So people in affected areas that were covered by, for example, the government's Mother and Child Benefit Program, and also the Employment Generation Program for the poorest. So existing social protection programs were able to get that support very quickly. So that falls a bit in the loss and damage category that we just discussed. And then also we can deliver at scale. In Indonesia, for example, there were quite a few discussions around fuel subsidy reforms. And it was quite the turning point when these measures to permanently reduce subsidies were coupled with social protection programs. So people were actually compensated for the lack of subsidies. So they wouldn't receive subsidies anymore for fuel, but they were actually then able to receive income support through a big social protection program. And so that also shows how many people can be reached throughout the transition at scale. All right, and then going back to the next slide, just to give you one more sense of what is currently happening at international level before we go into the examples. The good news is that in international climate negotiations and UNFCCC decisions, we now have social protection anchored in the main areas that we just mentioned. So when it comes to adaptation, the Global Goal on Adaptation now recognizes the role of social protection in reducing negative impacts of climate change on poverty and people's livelihoods. When it comes to loss and damage, we have the decision on the new fund, operationalization of the fund for responding to loss and damage that calls for scaling up support to social protection mechanisms. And when it comes to mitigation and a just transition, we also have the Just Transition Work Program that advocates for the inclusion of social protection in climate action for a just transition. And then last year, we also had the Baku Principles on Human Development for Climate Resilience that also, again, articulates the need to invest in social protection for resilience. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the IPCC report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but that's also a really good resource to look at how social protection actually supports climate change adaptation. And with that, I will hand over to Matthew on the next slide, who will take us through a few examples.
Great. Thanks very much, Christina. So hopefully that gives you a really good sense of both what social protection is and also, the different ways in which social protection can contribute to the climate agenda, to climate action. So, as you can see here, we've got basically the same 3 areas that Christina highlighted in terms of contributing to mitigation policies, both by directly supporting mitigation actions, but also by addressing some of those negative impacts of climate policies. Supporting people to adapt to climate change and also responding to shocks and helping to address loss and damage. We've added a 4th component here in terms of the value added of social protection and including it within the NDCs in terms of supporting countries to channel climate finance along these 3 domains towards vulnerable people, towards those most exposed to the impacts of climate change, so enabling a more people-centered use of climate finance. We think NDCs are a really important foundation, precondition really for accessing a lot of that climate finance, and so building this into NDCs is a key way for countries to signal their intentions to do this and then also to access some of those additional resources beyond domestic financing. So, that was the thinking really behind developing the note. That I'm sure the link has been posted in the chat. And yeah, just to maybe flesh this out, give you some more concrete sense of what we're talking about. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, the note contains, a number of examples from the last round from NDC 2.0 in terms of countries that did do this. A good example is Antigua Barbuda. So in that context, there was a role for social protection built into the NDC in relation to work transitions. So shifting industrial landscape and the green transition, so particularly around things like solar panels. Installation of solar energy within Antigua Barbuda to support people to train up and install those panels, but also in terms of supporting green businesses, taking advantage of the opportunities that the climate transition is creating, while helping to address some of the downsides that businesses might be facing where there's a shift in the economy, and a specific focus in this context on helping and supporting farmers and those working within the agri-food system to deal with these transitions, but also with the impacts of droughts and hurricanes. So in the Caribbean region as a whole, I'm sure people will see that they're regularly hit by hurricanes, but there's also been impacts on rainfall patterns, so increasing drought alongside these big-scale events. So you can see in this context, the use of social protection to support ambitious mitigation, also to address some of the loss and damage agenda as well. Next slide. And shifting context a bit to think about how social protection was built into Mozambique's NDC. Really, this was quite substantively done, thinking about the different contributions that social protection can make to climate adaptation in the Mozambique context. So a strong focus on community-based adaptation, local adaptation planning, and strengthening the climate resilience of vulnerable populations, particularly in rural settings. And here, they flagged up specifically the main public works program in the country called the Productive Social Action Program, to use that as an instrument for delivering some of these actions. So in terms of local adaptation planning, in terms of building community resilience through building climate resilient infrastructure, a lot around water management. So large parts of Mozambique are now more drought prone as a result of climate change. And then also linking social protection across to the disaster response system within the country. So it also gets hit by cyclones as well as by regular droughts, and using social protection as a mechanism for responding to these shocks. And Mozambique is a really interesting example to highlight because not only did they build a pretty extensive role for social protection into their NDC, but they recently had approved a Green Climate Fund project, a $28 million Green Climate Fund project, which specifically uses the Public Works Programme, the Productive Social Action Programme, to deliver local adaptation actions and to strengthen the local adaptation planning. So at the kind of local level, to strengthen the planning process there, and then to use the Public Works Programme to deliver on those local priorities. And here you can see, the point we were making earlier about, okay, so you put this into the NDC, and then that can be a means of, or very supportive of, drawing down some of this additional international finance to support those agendas. Next slide. And there's the little yellow button saying the climate finance point. Okay, so the note itself contains, a set of other examples. So, for example, within Pakistan, there was a role for social protection in supporting disaster-affected communities through cash transfer social protection. Examples in Moldova of supporting rural communities to adapt using the social protection system. In Malawi, quite an extensive range of measures to support both climate adaptation and climate mitigation, again, built into the NDC. So in NDC 2.0, you saw countries starting to engage with this agenda, and what we want to do really is to energize people to do that more extensively in the next round of NDCs. And we're going to hear a fantastic example once I finish talking from Francisca of work that's been done in Cambodia precisely to do this. But what we've got now is this is built into the note, a series of sort of ideas about how you can engage in this agenda. If you see the value added of integrating social protection into an NDC, how do you go about doing this? And just to say, the messages here are kind of for those people maybe outside of the social protection sector, how to engage with Ministries of Social Development or key partners. There's also a complementary note that we can also post in the chat for Ministries of Social Development. So people coming from the social protection perspective. So if that is you, there's another note which is maybe giving you a little bit more background on what NDCs are and the climate action agenda as a whole. But here we'll focus more on how can you engage with these partners. So firstly, link to your Ministry of Social Development, your Ministry of Social Protection, other key ministries within the social protection space. So that's often ministries of labour. There can, in certain contexts, like, for example, Ethiopia and Ministry of Agriculture run one of the main programs there. Share the NDC, the previous NDC, with partners there, and get them to kind of look through and see, have an initial scan, an initial thought about the links that could be made to social protection. Within your countries, there will be obviously support available through the NDC Partnership, but also through UN and other development partners like GIZ who are active, in different settings. Reach out to them. So we, as part of the task force, are all collaborating together at the moment to support different countries. So we've got UNICEF in some contexts, FAO, GIZ, ILO, other partners working in a range of different settings, supporting countries to do this. So reach out through this channel as well. You can contact those of us who are on this call, and then I think the most important thing is to start thinking about how do we exchange knowledge, how do we build those relationships, how do we build understanding on both sides of the contribution of what social protection can make to climate action, but also of the need for climate action to be more inclusive and the value added of incorporating climate into the social protection policies and strategies. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so once you've made those connections, thinking about what needs to be done. So Ministries of Social Development, Ministries of Social Protection will have data on vulnerability. They may even have data on climate vulnerability. They'll certainly have useful data and information that could be fed into socioeconomic impact assessments, thinking about climate risk, thinking about who needs to be supported, thinking about who is most impacted by climate change. And this will also be affected by the kind of different priority sectors within your country context. So depending on the priority sectors incorporated into the NDC, it's really important to think about, okay, how are those areas impacting on different population groups? Who is being excluded from current approaches? Who might be most impacted by the, say, mitigation policies that are being put in place? And to work with these partners to identify particular vulnerable and affected groups that could be given much greater consideration in the next round of the NDC. By identifying these risks, by jointly working together to work out, okay, which population groups are we most worried about, are we most concerned about, you can then review both existing programs and the scope for new programs to work out what might make sense to incorporate into your NDC. Going through that analysis process, engaging with different partners. And again, I think Francisca's going to give us excellent examples of how that might look in practice. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and then obviously we're at the moment in most country contexts. I mean, some NDCs have already been done, but it's a minority. We're still in the process of putting those together. And that's hugely important. So, we're really keen that countries engage now, if possible, to incorporate social protection into this round, this review, and to concretely integrate social protection actions into those plans. So that involves both the kind of thing we saw in the Mozambique context. Okay, well, what is the overall role? What are the programs that might make sense? How can we build those in? But also including social protection ministries, agencies as NDC implementing partners going forward with specific commitments, with specific roles, with specific responsibilities. So that when we move now from NDC design into NDC implementation, there is a concrete role for these ministries going forward. And that also will involve budget, and it will also involve allocation of resources. So thinking in concrete terms about the kinds of financing needs that we require for these kinds of programs, ideally building those estimates into the NDC specifically, or at least building costing exercises or some kind of planning process for how we identify and how we resource the actions that are going into the NDC. And then I would say a last element of this is thinking a bit beyond the NDCs, so thinking about national adaptation plans and other climate policies and strategies, as well as social protection strategies, which often, not always, but often these days incorporate climate as a risk, a key vulnerability, but it's not always aligned really with the overall national climate strategies. So making that alignment going forward so that you have, both on the climate side and on the social protection side, policies and strategies that are aligned, contributing to the same overall objectives and goals. And then, that will provide the basis, the foundation for really, strategic work going forward in the long term. Next slide, please. Yeah. So that's what we are encouraging you all to think about, and hopefully we've made the kind of case for why you might consider, scaling up the role of social protection in the NDC in your context, or supporting partners to do this. Just wanted to kind of reflect, there's one more slide after this, but just before we do that, to say, okay, so that is the ideal scenario. And, we really think that this is a journey that is worth taking. But journeys, go in steps, and so it shouldn't be overwhelming. It really is the case that, some countries are, incorporating, an acknowledgement of the role of social protection as an effective instrument, basically putting that in as a kind of a hook on which we can hang future ideas, future planning, but kind of a basic acknowledgement. But we can go further than that to outline more specific roles that social protection can play to support mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. Even further to identify specific programs, specific actions that can be adjusted, introduced, created to meet those goals. And then finally, this kind of much more integrated approach that we're talking about, where social protection is really embedded in the NDC, embedded in action plans, embedded in monitoring and evaluation, embedded also in social protection strategies. And perhaps the fourth level here is the one to aim at eventually, but if you can do something to just move in that direction, NDC and climate strategies, policies, processes are an ongoing process. This is something that we'll all be working on for the remainder of our careers. It can be, to take the first step is still a meaningful action. So I would encourage whatever level you are at in your country right now to get that process started. And, you can have these longer term ambitions to build on whatever steps you can take in this round of the NDC review. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so this is just a sort of final sum up really, but yeah, we are confident and we would love to support those of you on this call, I mean, both ourselves, but also all the partners who are out there working on this agenda to integrate social protection in NDCs, to deliver on climate goals for adaptation, for mitigation, and to support a just transition to ensure that climate action is increasingly inclusive of vulnerable population groups who we know are still being left out in too many contexts. And that means meeting their needs, but also, I mean, I guess we have the adaptation agenda is not just meeting their needs, but helping to, there's a promotive role of social protection to adapt, to activate the capacities of people to meet the challenges that climate is sending their way. And, this, as Christina pointed out, it's all aligned under the different agendas under the UNFCCC, which is that, the global agenda, and then also all the countries signing up to this. There's really a lot of momentum in this space right now. So yeah, it's a really great time to be thinking about this, to be starting on this journey so that we can make sure that climate action is increasingly inclusive, is increasingly meeting the needs of the entire population and increasingly addressing the social and economic as well as environmental challenges that we face. Okay, so that's taken us through social protection as a Y-link kit, some practical sort of suggestions, and now we're going to really delve into the detail in Cambodia to see how this works in practice. So over to you, Franziska.
Thank you very much, Christina and Matthew, for setting the scene. I will talk about how we are supporting our partner, which is the General Secretariat of the National Social Protection Council in Cambodia, to integrate social protection into the NDC 3.0. Can you go to my first slide? Exactly. Yeah, fine. Yeah, I will talk you quickly through where we stand, a little bit of the process and the challenges, and then, of course, I will show the draft measures that have been developed so far. So as you can see, we already have made quite some progress. I think a couple of weeks ago, my colleague Maren presented in the same network the progress, and we've even progressed further. So I'm going to point out 3 of the biggest milestones that we have achieved so far. So first and importantly, social protection and child protection have been approved as their own sector in the NDC 3.0. So this is the first time that is the case for Cambodia. And it's actually the first time in Cambodia that in any high levels policy document, you have such clear linkage pronounced. And secondly, we have a lot more interministerial coordination taking place. Our main partner, the General Secretariat of the National Social Protection Council, the GS-NSPC, has been accepted as a new member of the National Climate Change Technical Working Group. This might seem like a small step, but all in some countries, this can take quite long. I think this was a process of several months, and it's the first time that the Ministry of Environment and actually the Social Protection Lead Agency is in any kind of formalized platform together and able to exchange ideas on that topic. And thirdly, we definitely have an improved understanding of the role of social protection in climate change action. as well among the social protection actors, as well as the environmental side. There was a lot of work going into trainings, joint study tours, joint visits, and building that common understanding to understand each other's terminology and concepts. Next slide. So what have we identified as enabling factors for where we are right now? First one, I think I have to definitely point out, we have a very strong national leadership in the social protection sector. The General Secretariat for the National Social Protection Council is actually a council that represents 13 ministries that are all somehow involved in social protection and has the mandate to coordinate anything on related to social protection, from policy to program implementation. So the GS-NSPC had also taken a broad step by introducing COVID-19 emergency cash transfers, which were expanded to at-risk households during inflation times. And in 2022, they actually expanded the cash transfers to at-risk households during very extreme floodings. So that already really built the foundation to point out the nexus between social protection and climate change. We have also a very forward-looking policy framework. Just recently, the National Social Protection Policy Framework 2 had been launched that very explicitly calls for a social protection system that should be responsive to shocks and crises, including climate change. Not only focusing on short-term risk, but also the long-term impacts of climate risks. Secondly, very importantly, I think we had quite good partnerships and TA support. It was not only GIZ alone that has been driving this process. We had WFP as a very close partner that is also coordinating the work on disaster risk management, very closely related to social protection. UNICEF and UNDP, and all that was very much demand-driven to a very strong partner that guided us through the process. I think also not to forget is, I think, the UNFCCC process and the guidance of UNDP. I think overall in the process, it's very helpful to have these very concrete milestones, these very concrete formats, and to have, and UNDP was the TA partner for the Ministry of Environment in Cambodia, to have somebody where you constantly can go and ask on process question, formality question on how to best go about getting the process correct. Next slide. One challenge that I would like to point out, it took us quite a while to reposition social protection within the climate change agenda, because much focus in social protection was given on disaster risk management and shock responsive social protection. Following COVID-19, there was really a fertile ground to advance shock responsive social protection agenda, and very early on in 2023, the government adopted the shock responsive social protection framework, which was a major step forward to really look beyond traditional social protection systems, but to look into what role it can play in terms of crisis and shocks. However, I don't know, I think there's an animation. If you click forward, I think there should be something showing the different, it's more clearly now. However, it came with the challenge that social protection was very much seen only as a tool for disaster response, rather than a pillar for systemic climate resilience and a driver for inclusive green transformation. So that was quite a little bit of effort for us to broadening this conceptual framing and to reposition social protection within the climate change agenda, and not only as a crisis response mechanism. And we worked very much in our capacity development measures and some study tours to highlight the role of social protection in adaptation, livelihood diversification, risk reduction, and social equity. So I thought that was maybe worthwhile to note, because I think in many other countries also the disaster risk management debate is much more dominant in the social protection sector than the climate change agenda. Next slide. So let me walk you quickly through the timeline of events that brought us where we are. And I'm honest that slide is rather dense and might be actually much better for you to look at later on than through the presentation. But it captures a few milestones and it captures a little bit the process and a few points that I would like to make. It's very much written the timeline from a GIZ or TA perspective in showing what we have done in order to get the process where it is right now. As you see, the red markers is wherever GIZ really took an active role. The green markers is where UNDP and the NDC process put deadlines or milestones, and the blue markers is where our sector and our national government partners had to come in with like a bigger national consultation. What I wanted to show with that slide is, I think, a couple of points. One is somebody has to start the conversation. And in that case, in Cambodia, it was GIZ that reached out, I mean, after consultation with our partners and asking, would you find that interesting to be working with the NDC process? Do you think this is an avenue that we should pursue? We started to reach out to UNDP to understand how this all works, because it hasn't been done for the sector before. And we made the first few connections. We started webinars. We brought people in who could explain us how NDC 2.0 has worked and what are the steps that are included. So yeah, that I think is one of the first points. Second, as you can see, it actually takes quite a lot of time. I think we started in May 2024 with reaching out, understanding the process, lots of capacity development in between. And it's a process that is, in the end, quite resource and time intensive. Thirdly, and that is maybe not so much reflected visibly, is that partnerships really matter deeply. Obviously, it was not GIZ alone. I think we worked very closely with WFP, who was very active on the disaster risk management side. We were guided by UNDP through the whole process, and UNICEF also as a co-lead for the social protection and the child protection sector. That really made a huge difference to come together and guide the national partners. And I think what a fourth point and last point I would like to make here is personal relationships. I think we sometimes underestimate how much it can help if people know each other. So we had a joint study tour to Australia funded by the Australians for social protection actors, the Ministry of Environment, but also for disaster risk management actors. And really had a lot of follow-up, a lot of joint brainstorming to come up with the measures that have been put on paper now. And I think it helped a lot that people at different levels of ministries got to know each other, exchanged numbers, and could ask quick questions in order to come up with something that everybody can agree with. Next slide. Yeah, coming here now probably to the most interesting one. These are the 4 measures that have been drafted so far. 1st of April, we had our sectoral consultation. So this is now what is agreed among the sector. At the end of this month, there will be the national consultation led by Ministry of Environment and UNDP. And then probably there will be another round of consultations and refinements. And then I think the deadline is June, July for sending off everything to the Ministry of Environment, and consultations in the sectors will be over. So the 4 measures that Cambodia has come up with is, the first one is building climate resilience among poor, vulnerable and at-risk households by strengthening the routine social protection programs and service delivery. That very first measure very much just focuses on increasing enrollment and increasing access to really make the systems, having the system more reach in order to react at larger scale if any crisis occurs. The second one reads reducing climate vulnerability through shock responsive social protection among poor, vulnerable and at-risk populations, and improving interoperability of social protection systems. This measure very much focuses on the ability of the government to timely and effectively deliver support to people who could be affected. And it includes also interoperable data and service delivery systems, and the linkage to the early warning. So this is the measure that has the closest link also to the disaster risk management, which is represented as our own sector in the NDC 3.0s in Cambodia. The third one is a just transition measure, enabling a just and inclusive transition by expanding social protection to those whose livelihoods are and will be affected by climate change. If you go into the details, there's a lot of what we call in social protection the cash plus. It's not only just support, but any kind of diversification of livelihoods, graduation-based social protection, linking social protection programs to other social services, but also thinking about introducing public work programs. That is fairly new for Cambodia. None of these programs have been yet upscaled at large. So we are actually quite happy that with this process, also from a social protection perspective, we could push the partners to be a bit more innovative and daring in what they're going to plan over the next few years. The fourth one is establishing the foundations for climate-sensitive housing, support for poor, vulnerable, and at-risk populations. It's an interesting one. The new National Social Protection Framework 2 actually has identified housing and homelessness as one of the key risks or areas that they want to engage in. And that is, nothing has been put in place yet. So it's very much a measure where they're putting forward that they want to have feasibilities and explore the options of addressing the needs of climate affected, or well, poor and climate affected population groups by thinking of climate sensitive housing support, whatever that could mean. And that is, yeah, also quite new, but quite interesting. And we're very excited to support our partners in the next few years to actually implement a lot of these measures. Having said that, of course, I think forward looking, the government of Cambodia is also interested in attracting climate finance from globally in order to incentivize and take some of these measures forward. I think that's my last slide, and happy to answer any question. Yeah, this is the last picture, shows the national consultation, sectoral consultation that we had, where everybody from the sector or who is closely linked to the sector was agreeing on the final draft that is being submitted now to the Ministry of Environment.
Thank you, Franziska. That was a lot of information, I think, in general for all of you, but I'm very happy to see we already have a few questions. One longer one in the Q&A space, so maybe we'll address that one first. I also saw, I think, Ronesh Prasad, who had a hand up earlier, and then also Christina. So if the two of you want to come in after, then we can also address your questions. So the first one would be how to distinguish between target setting, specifically the decision for conditional and unconditional. I'm assuming that refers to cash transfers. And also the criteria to consider in terms of mitigation versus adaptation options. What decides that threshold? So I hope that the Cambodia example already answered that to some extent, but obviously the criteria regarding mitigation versus adaptation goals to be supported, that is really based on the prioritization of the country. So we see in some countries, Brazil, for example, has already submitted their NDC. I think that was November last year, committed to, I think, around 60 to 67% emissions reduction, and also has the commitment to strengthen adaptation in its NDC. And so there, obviously, the direction is clear, right? There's a really strong focus on mitigation, and they're also looking at how to support livelihoods, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And so that's when you can actually look at how social protection programs could come in, especially existing programs that Brazil has built in the past to support that agenda. So number one would be prioritization in the NDC of the different goals. Number two would be what programs, social protection programs, and also broader policies already exist. And then obviously it's also a negotiation process between the different line ministries to see how those programs and actions could actually work together to achieve the commitments outlined in the NDC. Maybe regarding conditional and unconditional, I know Matt would have a lot to say about that, so I'll hand over to you regarding that point.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, I mean, just to, maybe add a little bit to what you just said as well. I mean, I think NDCs were originally very much focused on mitigation. So the first round of NDCs, for most countries, it was primarily about mitigation. They are becoming increasingly documents that capture, the whole of the kind of climate action agenda. So that's mitigation and adaptation. And very often, yeah, as Christina said, it's a balance. It depends on countries' priorities. But we would also like to see people being ambitious. I mean, Francisca spoke to this in terms of, working with partners to make them think in an ambitious way about the role that social protection can play, both in relation to mitigation and adaptation. And on the mitigation side, I mean, I would say, there's the kind of co-benefits of things like public works programs where they're directly contributing to mitigation goals, but really a big role for social protection in addressing some of the negative downsides for vulnerable communities of mitigation policies, like restrictions on access to natural resources, forest, fisheries, whatever, and potentially changes to fuel subsidies that might impact on poor and vulnerable populations. So, thinking in those terms as well. On the conditionalities, I mean, it really depends. It depends on how a country's social protection system is set up. And we recently held an event in Latin America with the Inter-American Development Bank, specifically on this space, exploring different options, different approaches. Now, in Latin America, conditional cash transfers are huge. Everybody uses this approach, and there's a lot of environmentally conditioned cash transfers in place. So Brazil has a Bolsa Verde scheme. There's another scheme called Proeso in Paraguay, where you have a conditional cash transfer with more traditional conditions around enrollment in schools, certain social conditions, and then environmental conditions in terms of more like a payment for ecosystem services approach, where people have to deliver sustainable outcomes, reduce deforestation, and then they get an additional payment. So that's a model that countries could explore, but again, it would be really dependent upon what the social protection system looks like there. One area we do want to explore actually is more of that, is how a lot of countries outside of Latin America are using payment for ecosystem services, where there's only really environmental goals, and could those be turned into more blended models using both, with both social and environmental outcomes built in, along the lines of the models we're seeing in Latin America. But yeah, I mean, that would be a sort of a discussion in a specific context and with the specific partners. Great. So we had another hand from Ronesh, whose hand has maybe gone down. Christina, I can see, said she didn't mean to raise her hand. Ronesh,
do you want to come in? And maybe also the question to the NDCP, if you can enable participants to come in with audio. If not, if that should be difficult, we can also put our email addresses in the chat. We'll just put mine and also Matthew's here, and Francisca, if you want to put yours as well, if there are any Cambodia-related questions. And otherwise, I'm sure you can also contact the organizers of the NDCP. They usually also forward questions to us, and then we can respond bilaterally. Maybe that might be helpful if it shouldn't be possible. All right. If there are no other hands, otherwise this would be the last opportunity for you to ask a question. we very much thank you for your attention and also the questions raised. And we're still available to answer any additional follow-up questions you may have, or also if you actually would like to connect and receive support from international partners. And thanks also to Shreya Gupta. We saw your message in the chat, and I'm sure Cambodia would also be very happy to make that connection. That sounds good.
I just wanted to really emphasize a point that Franziska made about the importance of those connections. I mean, here you're talking about connections between countries, but also connections within countries. All the context that we've been working, like in the Caribbean, for example, and in Latin America, where, you know, one of the biggest, most important steps is just bringing people from the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Social Protection, whatever that is called in that country, together, so that they meet, know each other, exchange WhatsApp numbers, this kind of thing. And that just is such a critical step in the whole process that helps to then catalyze all of the changes going forward. And it just jumped out to me when listening to the kind of specific experiences in Cambodia, because I think it's quite a basic thing, but it's such a fundamental thing. And, you know, we've got a mix of people, I think, attending this call, but, you know, that is one of the, you know, the most practical early steps that you could take, I think, would be to facilitate those kind of engagements. So it's not to a question, but it's just one further point that I wanted to make at the end.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, everyone. Looking at our NDCP colleagues, if there are any final words. Thank you. Nothing else sounds good. And we saw there's another comment in the chat. We would like to engage more on this for the Africa region. That is really good to hear. If you can reach out to us via email, that would be very helpful. We also recently had a discussion, a webinar on the Sahel region. If that's of interest, there's quite a bit of material, and we're happy to engage and share those. So please email us. That's great news.
So if you have a question for any of our panelists, please put your question in the chat and we will be able to answer them here. And Christina, I can hand the floor over to you to go through this. And again, apologies everyone for the limited amount of time we have to answer questions here, but we can certainly follow up and we will have a second session.
No worries. Thank you so much. And I'm just seeing several come in. So the first question is actually for Maren in Cambodia, looking at what aspects of children or child protection was considered in Cambodia, so specific social protection measures for children.
Yeah, it's actually, so they changed from a line ministry approach to a sectoral approach in the NDCs 3.0, and there's two new sectors. One is child protection and one is social protection. So child protection is being an own new sector in the NDCs 3.0. They are being grouped, but not in the development of the measures. So I think that they gained a lot of momentum as well from the child protection view. I'm not able to talk about the individual measures. I don't know them.
Thanks so much. I'm sure that already helps answer that question. Then I see another question. Do you see ways for social protection programs to contribute to averting, minimizing, and in particular addressing loss and damage? And also, what about cases in which social protection systems are yet to be established in their infancy? So I can start, I mean, first maybe with the second one, because it's a bigger question. I used to work in the Eastern Caribbean, and there we had quite a few countries with very small social protection systems. So where about 5 to 9% of the population were covered by the biggest social, especially social assistance programs. And it was quite interesting to see how much can be done with systems that are, in fact, in their infancy, as you say. I mean, first of all, I would argue it's important to include these commitments in the NDCs no matter what, because they also help with the political momentum to actually further build and strengthen social protection systems. That's the first thing. The second thing is when you then actually talk about implementation, it's quite surprising how much you can do by expanding existing rather small programs and actually building on those structures, institutions, and implementation mechanisms already in place. And then also thirdly, I think it's even more important now in countries where you have very little social protection coverage to address climate change related challenges, because those are often the most vulnerable countries. And as Maren said, the most vulnerable and also poorest parts of the population are often most affected. So in that sense, yes, there is a lot that can be done. And in a way, these commitments in NDCs are a very good starting point. Celine, did you want to add something to that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Christina, and a very good question, and not much to add. I mean, now every country in the world has a social protection system, and as it says in the question, a different level of development as well. And I mean, Christina's message is very important. The first step is to look at what exists in the country in terms of system already, in terms of institution, and how we can continue strengthening them and extending the coverage. This is also a very important effort, because the more people we will have covered by the National Social Protection System, the more people will also receive support related to the climate impact. So it's also important to continue effort in strengthening the system, and including, I think the question was also trying to look at countries where the situation is very difficult. I was also working in the Sahel region, where social protection coverage is very limited and the issues and challenges are multiple. I think what is also important is when external aid support comes to the country, to make sure that it also channels through the social protection system, because it both helps to reach out the population, but also strengthening the national system. So the system can also continue developing its institution, its mechanism, its digitalization to support future crises. Thank you. Over.
Thanks. And then there was a second part to that question, looking at loss and damage, and especially non-economic losses and damages. And it's tricky, obviously, because non-economic losses, it's essentially if there is loss of property, different types of infrastructure, agricultural production, quite a few more. Also looking at health, for example, there is a lot that social protection can do. I don't think we can dig into that too deep, but maybe just to say, I mean, first, in terms of infrastructure, obviously there are public works programs that help protect infrastructure and build it in a climate resilient way, but then also after something has happened to actually reinstate that infrastructure and actually build it back better. That's one link. There are quite a few so-called cash plus approaches where people get financial support and also assets to help with agricultural production, to actually help with more climate resilient crops in the future. That's another link. There are also quite a few programs that help with health issues after, for example, a big extreme weather event has happened. Yeah, just to name a few. So yes, there's a lot that can be done. I just have one more question. If you bear with us for maybe 2 more minutes, then we can answer that final one. There's a question: given geopolitical shifts and shrinking fiscal space, who can countries look for financial support to continue, strengthen their social protection measures and efforts? Now, one quick point on that one. Obviously, a lot of it is actually a domestic financing question. So how do we actually allocate and prioritize domestic funding better, more efficiently, also prioritizing these kinds of actions within national budgets, looking at how to also address climate and social challenges jointly so that we don't double costs, but rather find synergies. But obviously, there are a lot more options also in the international space. There are huge climate funds, the Big Four, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the GEF, the Environmental Facility, then the CIFs, the Climate Investment Funds. And now there's also a new fund for responding to loss and damage being put together, established with the big board meeting in April. So there are quite a few options for countries to get additional financing. Also, not just grants, but also loans through multilateral development banks, for example, which increasingly have a very strong focus on more inclusive and socially just climate finance. And so I'll just leave it at that, but maybe Celine, if you want to say.
Yeah, very, very short, because Maren, you have a very interesting question also in the chat for you. Thanks, Christina. 2 more ideas to explore when we talk about financing, and I completely agree with the comment in the question that we may see a decrease in the fiscal space available, including for social protection. We have multiple priorities in countries. I think it's important also when we work within the climate action to also link through these processes like the NDC 3.0 with the broader picture and development of the country, to link with also, I mean, the Ministry of Economy, Finance is part of the process, but also Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Social Affairs, because one way, as Christina said, to finance social protection, we also be through formalization. I think we really need to accelerate the formalization of the economy as a way to contribute directly for the social protection expenditure through the contributory system, the social insurance we know, but also it will help broadening the tax base to also increase revenues entering into the government coffers to continue strengthening social protection, including for those who do not have the contributory capacity. So formalization of the economy is an important one, and everything is linked also with a just transition. And the second idea is also to look at the investment of the public development banks as well in countries, and to approach those those investors to see how we can gear those investments towards creation of jobs, creation of decent jobs, also investment in social protection, because here is where the money will continue arriving through investment in infrastructure, building roads, building bridges, and also investment in the energy sector. So to also approach those and be part of this negotiation to make sure that those investments also create a space for creating decent jobs and extending social protection. Thank you.
And finally, handing over to Maren for one more question regarding Cambodia in the chat, the final one today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Make me think back. And okay, there was not one moment where we decided, okay, we're gonna enter social protection in the NDCs, not in GIZ and not in the country and not also in our partner. It's a discussion that evolved. GIZ was very working with together with the World Food Programme very closely on the shock responsive social protection operational framework, which was a policy document that was developed post-COVID to institutionalize the experiences made during COVID with scaling up the social protection system. And then I guess at one point, and with the frequency also of climate disasters, you just get to a point where you think, what else can social protection do? And it's a mix of push and pull. I think, the frequency of crises that need to be addressed through social protection increase. Then there is also globally, I think, more efforts or more processes pointing towards the integration of social protection in climate change. There was a great report coming out last year, Rethinking Social Protection and Climate Change, financed by DFAT and from Anna McCord and Cecilia Costella, and that provided a framework that helped us kind of shaping the integration further. In Cambodia, there was also, in the case of Cambodia, the government had also interest in applying for the Global Shield against climate risks, and there's a dedicated, it invites partners as well to look at social protection systems and their role in climate change. So I guess it's it's a bit of a process that is being directed from all different sides.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for answering all these questions. There's another comment in the chat. One of the ways to formalize the financing of all NDCs and climate actions is through integrating these in national development plans, and also as a link to the national budget, which I find quite interesting. Thanks for that comment. All right, our time has come to an end. Thank you so much for bearing with us despite technical difficulties. And we've put our email addresses in the chat as well if there are any additional questions that we couldn't answer today. There will be a second round of this webinar in the second half of April. I think I'm looking at Sarah, date to be confirmed. But either way, we're very happy that you were able to join today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much for bearing with us with our technical issues. We will send an email to everyone who registered with the link to the slides, any resources we mentioned, and the email addresses, contact information for our panelists here. So thank you all so much for joining, and we look forward to having you at another one of our webinars. So thank you so much.